Okay, so firstly, for my regular subscribers, if you're wondering about the different location, I'm in the middle of moving everything in my room to another part of the house, so it's a big transition, as I'm calling it. Hence a different location. Okay, so to get straight into the video, I want to talk about political ideology and why I abandoned the political left. Now, there is a few things I need to explain with this. Firstly, it would be misleading to suggest that I'm coming from a position where I was ever really had my heart in the political left, because that wouldn't be the case. So I don't want anyone who does identify themselves as a liberal or a socialist or anything else that is more on the political left to say that I'm being insincere. I'm not pretending that I was ever fully had my heart in the left. However, there were times in my life where I was definitely much more orientated towards the left, let me put it that way. And I'll get into a little bit of the history in a minute. Secondly, to people of a right wing persuasion, you too may misinterpret the pitch of this video. I'm not speaking as a right winger, and I'm not someone who is kind of dissing the left because I have found the right. There's still many areas of the political right I take issue with. The only reason I'm not focusing on the right in this video is because I've never called myself a conservative. So it's not really necessary to explain why I abandoned the right, because I was never really attached to the right in the first place, whereas I was with the left. But I would respectfully say, don't to people, don't come on and try and convert me to conservatism. I make these videos to express my point of view. And I have to say, most subscribers are respectful. My regular subscribers are, but I'm talking about, there have been a few individuals who've tried to, I've made political videos and they've tried to change my mind on something. I don't mind people voicing a different point of view and saying they disagree with me on something, but I don't appreciate being spoken to like a child and saying, oh, you need to believe in this or that. I don't assume to do it with anyone else, so I would ask that they don't do it with me. Um, I do consider myself now a centrist. It's not something I've always called myself. And I also recognize that the term is problematic because it's vague, and there's no escaping that. It is a vague concept because centrism covers a very, very broad range of viewpoints. Um, my centrism is basically adopted from centre left and centre right, and some more hardline views. I mean, I can't say all my views are moderate. I do have some quite hardline views on some issues. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I don't associate hardline views with being the same as extreme views. I think there is a difference. I think someone could passionately believe in something and strongly defend it. But I think where extremism comes in is when you're threatening violence in support of your ideology. On this as a necessary case of survival or something. But that's the difference. So, a bit of history. Like I said, I've never been a fully pledged lefty, but there were times in my life where I was definitely much more to the left. Just over a decade ago, when my country was about to invade Iraq, when Tony Blair was in office, at that time, 2002, 2003, I was definitely flirting with the quite hard left. I'll be honest about that. Now, I was 17 at the time, and today I put it down to youthful. This might sound like a cliche, but it is true in my case. To youthful experimentation, interest. I kind of had this, call it romantic notion of like the 1960s counterculture and hippies and peace, not war, and all that sort of thing. And what was happening in the world in 2002 3, there was these huge anti-war protests in Rome and London and elsewhere. And I really tapped into that. At the time, I felt it was a disastrous decision. I still believe it was a grave mistake, although I'm much more balanced in my views on it now. But I really tapped into that. And to be quite honest, I didn't give a lot of thought to it. It's not that it wasn't sincere. I did really believe that. So I wasn't just doing it for a laugh. I really did. I remember getting extremely angry and thinking, what gives us a right to invade this sovereign nation? And there was all sorts of things. And at the time, I felt quite frankly anti-British, which is something that was a very brief sort of mindset. I am pleased that I never went further down the line to get radicalized would be the wrong word, but to really endorse that ideology full time. Even at that time, there was times I sort of questioned it and sort of thought, well, I do feel very strongly about this, but do I agree with everything? The truth is, I didn't understand everything, not just about the political situation, but also about the issues that were involved with left wing politics. I mean, I do remember going to this book group. There was a guy that was giving advice on writing, and he was a real Blairite. He was a real supporter of Tony Blair, and I remember having quite a tense argument with him. In retrospect, he probably thought I was a bit of a brat because I was pontificating views that I really didn't know that much about. I also remember some of the anti-war protests that I was involved in. Now, don't get me wrong, there were many decent people who were there for the right reasons, but there were some people who were on quite, there were the sort of people who will protest any government decision. Anyway, that was a relatively brief period. I'm talking about 6 months or so. And I kind of grew out of it. I never really fully endorsed it. Um, But I do have some now rather interesting photos of me wearing C&D badges and stuff, and I had the beard then. But even at that time, I had some views that were still quite right wing. For example, on crime, that's something that has never changed. So even then, there were flickers, and there were some little parts of my political DNA that were not entirely left wing. Even then, so, a bit of history. For 5 years, I was a member of the Liberal Democrat Party from 2005 to 2010. I joined under the leadership of Charles Kennedy, the late Charles Kennedy, who is a man I still have a lot of respect for. He was a lot more to the left than myself now, but I believe that Charles Kennedy was a thoroughly decent man who had his heart in the right place, put it that way. And that's not just hyperbole because he has passed away, but I really do believe that. In fact, it was his leadership that got me to join the party in the first place. In fact, one track that I want to keep throughout this video is the point that despite everything I'm saying, there are people on the left, individuals and leaders who I do still very much respect. And I probably always will. And on the right, I try to rise above being tribal to the extent of their right wing, so I reject them, or their left wing, so I reject them. I try to look at people as individuals. Obviously, party politics gets into there is a degree of tribalism that's unavoidable. But yeah, so anyway, as a member of the Liberal Democrats for 5 years, that involved, to my American viewers and international viewers, the Liberal Democrats are basically a centre left Liberal Party. I'm not sure what the American equivalent would be, possibly the Green Party. The Democrats wouldn't be a valid comparison because they're a much bigger party, and the Democrats' history is very different from the Liberal Democrat history, so it wouldn't be really an appropriate comparison. Probably the Green Party is the closest American equivalent. But basically, I was involved to the extent where I was actively canvassing, campaigning, and I stood myself at low level, very low level, as a local city councillor twice. First occasion, I got 279 votes. The second occasion, 773 votes. So I tripled my own result. That was a worthy political experience, and I'm grateful I'd done it. But eventually, I left the party because I realised there was too many areas that I just disagreed with the party on. Now, initially, the reason I left was actually a left-wing reason, and that was because of Nick Clegg's decision to join the coalition government. And I felt that he was tapping into conservative views on unemployment that really, really I could not accept. Initially, actually, I was defending Nick Clegg's decision, but after a while, some of the statements he was coming out with just sounded like he was justifying Tory positions. I've kind of reverted somewhat on that again, and I'll be honest, I have flip flopped a bit on this, and I now somewhat defend Nick Clegg. I believe they made a decision that was very difficult, and they had an opportunity for government. And I believe that Tory excesses got worse when the Lib Dems left. But without making things too complicated, in the end, I left the party initially for a left wing reason. But then I also started considering, well, actually, there's some right wing reasons why I don't connect with them either. I've never been happy with the Liberal Democrats' stance on crime because crime is something I have very strong views on. I have been a victim of crime insofar as I've been driven by my home bike gangs. Now, the Liberal Democrats are a typical centre left party. They're all about understanding social causes, and they're not as radical as some parties in terms of leniency towards criminals, but still far too left wing for my way of thinking. And I actually think that the greatest liberalism is the liberalism for people to live free from fear. And I felt it was slightly, to focus when the party focused on trying to understand criminals and try to come up with all these social background explanations, it worked me up, to be honest. So I felt I was being a hypocrite by staying in a party where there was this very important issue that I fundamentally disagreed with. There were many other issues I agree with them on, and I will give the Liberal Democrats respect and credit for raising, for example, mental health as an issue, which is a very important issue. But their stance on crime, I just find too much to the left. I also find their attitude to issues like Islamism, violent radical Islamism, was completely lax. Their attitude to immigration was out of touch. There was too many areas I just felt that they were out of touch, and in the end, it's not a decision that I regret. I'm not going to, get a kick out of kicking the party or anything, and I still believe a lot of decent MPs lost their seats last year in both the Liberal Democrats and Labour. People who I didn't personally know, but I knew of, and they were good MPs who did not deserve to lose their seats. So I think it was just a backlash against the coalition government. So that's a bit of my own history. Since 2010, I haven't been aligned to any political party. Will I be in the future? Only time will tell. I definitely see politics in my future, but to what extent, I don't know. Um, so, so why have I rejected, or why do I reject the left more recently? And I'm just going to be very candid here and try and explain some of the reasons. I'm not going to explain the areas, I'm not going to get into the areas where I disagree with the right, but just take it as a given that there are many areas I disagree with the political right. So if you're left wing and you think that I'm being very narrow minded, that's not the case because there are many areas I also disagree with the right. I'm just not focusing on it for this video. So I believe on a lot of important issues, too much of the political left is just incredibly naive. Incredibly naive. On issues of great importance like immigration, like Islamic radical Islamic terrorism, Islamism, the left is woefully out of touch. And I'm not talking about everyone on the left, that is an important point I want to make. I'm not talking about everyone. But there is a sizable proportion of the political left that is far too reactionary when they hear these things discussed. Their attitude is always to focus on the political rights rather than just focus on the issue being discussed. So their counter argument is always about attacking racists or attacking the far right. And that's fine. But the problem is they're focusing on that to the point where they make that the main issue. And that to me indicates that they simply have their priorities wrong. They don't realize that there is actually very important issues going on here. Now, I also think there's inconsistency and hypocrisy with what I would call the regressive left, and there have been figures on the left to their credit have pointed this out. What do I mean by regressive left? Well, the regressive left focuses on multiculturalism and focuses on pleasing or what they perceive to be pleasing minority groups in place of what their traditional values would be. So, as an example, they will be reluctant to criticize a particular community because they would perceive it to be racist. And yet, if that particular community has a problem, for example, in attitudes to women or attitudes to homosexuals, then there's a clear inconsistency there. So, for example, when a lot of women were attacked in Cologne in Germany on New Year's Eve, you would think that's a women's rights issue. You would think that would be something that feminists and the left would be really concerned about. And yet it was those on the right who had to point that out and say this is disgraceful what had happened. Just recap, what had happened was there were groups of migrant men, and I'm not going to name any particular group and I'm not going to slander all migrants, but there were, frankly, sizable proportions. We're not talking about one or two individuals who basically felt these women were free game. And there is no equivalency. There is simply no equivalency to individual cases of sexual assault happening in Western countries to this sort of mass assault that was going on there. There's simply no equivalency. Yes, you get rapists in Western countries. Yes, you get perverts in Western countries. But there is a cultural set of values that are very different. And frankly, there are countries, predominantly Islamic countries, where sexuality is repressed. So young men feel that when they come to Western countries where there is much more liberal dress codes, they feel that women are free game and they feel they somehow have a right to attack women. Um, so the left should have absolutely been on the forefront of that. Now, I looked at the Facebook pages of left wing groups such as the Liberal Democrats, and I thought it was appalling that they couldn't even bring themselves to forcefully condemn that. I'm not saying they're completely ignoring it, but when they're prioritizing, for example, the rise of groups like Pegida, who I don't support, by the way, but when they focus so much on the rise of the right, they're failing to understand why far right groups are rising. And a large part of it is this perception that establishment left wing figures simply don't care. There is a cartoon that's online, a meme that has been going around, and it shows basically this young woman being raped by some Muslim men. And it shows her father being held back by police and saying, "That's my daughter, stay away from her." And some left wing figures on the side saying, "Racist, racist." Now, this is a provocative cartoon, but I think there is frankly some truth in it. That is to say that when there are issues coming about, there are cultural clashes from multiculturalism, when these issues are raised, the first response from the left is usually, "Oh, that's scaremongering, that's racism, etc., etc." And yet, only when it is too late are these things discussed. Look at the Rotherham abuse scandal. Look at the Rochdale abuse scandal. Even now, the left is trying to downplay that. Even now, the left is trying to insist that this shouldn't be discussed. And that, frankly, I find utterly reprehensible. That they would actually find the perception of community cohesion to be more important than the welfare of young girls. Where there is a problem with a particular community, it needs to be discussed because safety is more important than political correctness. It really is. And, that's not to say that generalizations are right. It's not to say that people should say, "Oh, all Muslim men are rapists." Of course not. Of course not. But where there is a problem, it has to be discussed. And to extend this a little bit, although I'm no supporter of Donald Trump, and I've been quite vocal on why I don't believe Trump is fit for the White House, I think some on the American left are wrong to completely dismiss everything that Trump raises. Say, for example, the immigration issue, and I did bring this up in the previous video. Um, I think if there are people who are breaking American law by coming in undocumented as illegal immigrants, that's an issue. They're knowingly breaking American laws. And whilst it is a smear to call all Mexicans rapists, the idea that no Mexicans are rapists is also wrong because, frankly, there are gangs from Mexico, from Central America, that are causing serious problems in American cities. This is just reality. What I detest about political correctness is it's nothing to do with politeness. It's got everything to do with dishonesty, fundamentally. The left, political correctness is like their religion. A large part of the left. It's not everyone. You have some figures like Bill Maher who would be left wing in many areas, but he's dead set against political correctness. So be clear here, it's not a case that everyone who's on the political left is politically correct. That's not the case. And likewise, not everyone on the right can say that they are against political correctness, because I do believe there is such a thing as right wing political correctness. That is, a certain taboo subjects that the right think shouldn't be discussed. So, both sides have certain sensitivities. Overall, though, I do think the left have a worse track record when it comes to freedom of expression. Overall, that's not to say that right wing authoritarian figures don't. You could get many examples of that, but overall, I think the left are they're much more keen to legislate on speech than the political right are, in my opinion, from my experience. Certainly, that's the case in the United Kingdom. And when we had to see hate laws being passed, or the concept of legislation being put forward simply for having an opinion. So, say, for example, someone opposes gay marriage or they speak out against feminism, we're actually in a situation, and I am very concerned about this, where people are actually discussing whether legislation should be put into place to make it illegal to have these opinions. And I'm not talking about spreading, advocacy of violence. I'm talking about simply having the opinion, and that's to me utterly reprehensible. Um, Another area where I found myself drifting away from the left is that they very much associate with progressive politics. Now, I don't disagree with every aspect of progressive politics, but there are areas of it I find are getting a bit, frankly, absurd. When you get someone who was born male being voted Woman of the Year, I believe it was Bruce Jenner, Caitlyn Jenner. Now, when the left totally endorse that as being normal, and yet they attack, let's call it the traditional family structure of one man, one woman as being a social construct, then I think they've lost the plot. I really do. I I'm not against transgender people. Totally support their right to do whatever they want with their own body, but I do not believe that someone who is born male will ever be a woman. And if that offends some people, I'm sorry, but I just don't believe you can argue with science. Forget religion. Forget religion. It's basic science. A human being cannot biologically change their gender. They just can't. At best, you can have the hormone treatment. You can change your genitals. You can, mutilate your genitals, which is really what it is. And there is a lot of health side effects from that. But ultimately, and I will use a preferred pronoun out of politeness, but I believe that when the left panders to this sort of thinking, and it isn't, perhaps it's wrong to just focus on the left. There's even a few, actually, it was a conservative transgender councillor recently tried to sue her Labour counterpart because he used the wrong pronoun. Uh, so the right isn't entirely innocent when it comes to being too sensitive. But yeah, that advocacy of progressive politics. I mean, Justin Trudeau is a good example. I really have mixed views on Justin Trudeau. Part of me quite likes the guy. I think he is prepared to say and do things that other leaders won't do. Um, on the other hand, when he, for example, goes to a gay pride parade and joins in the front, and to me, if I was a Canadian, I would be thinking, is that really a priority, a national priority? I think sometimes left wing figures kind of jump on the bandwagon a little bit to endorse causes to be popular with the progressive movement just because they are. Um, it's one thing standing up for human rights. I completely support that, but I just think sometimes it gets into sort of doing it for the sake of image, and certainly the right do it as well with their equivalent, pandering to hard right thinking. But I just think that, to be honest, kind of gets on the nerves. Like, and feminism is another major area where I really, really get irritated with the left. Feminism is something that is much more associated with the left. There is right wing feminists actually, so it's not 100% something that is associated with the left. But let's be honest, it is much more associated with the left. Without getting into all the details, because I've already made this very clear, I believe modern Western feminism is deeply intolerant. hypocritical and ultimately hateful movement. So that's yet another area where I find myself distancing from the left. I guess ultimately there's this idea that if you don't if you don't sort of subscribe to left wing thinking, if you detract in any way, you're perceived to be an asshole, and I think that's unfortunate. There's this kind of reactionary attitude with the left, and to be fair, the right is just as bad. And it's kind of this childish idea that, and the left have this: if someone is right wing, it doesn't matter who they are as an individual, they by extension are an asshole or a bitch. Now, without question, there are assholes and unpleasant people on the right, and I think the right do themselves no favours sometimes by making excuses for people who are basically just mean spirited. But I think sometimes when you get so tribal, I think some on the left oppose right wing people solely because they are right wing. They're not actually interested in engaging in adult debate. And there's people on the right who are just as guilty of that, where they're not interested in engaging in adult debate and they just want to, call people names. I think certainly this can be seen in American politics, to some extent in British politics as well. There's a lot of this Punch and Judy thing going on. As Theresa May hasn't exactly been helping that with a lot of her low below jibes against Jeremy Corbyn, but it's been widely said that this American election cycle is the most tumultuous ever. Now, if we look back to, say, Ford Carter, say what you want about Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, they may have bored the country to death. They may not have been the most exciting candidates, but there you had two candidates who were level-headed, who were just putting forward their policies, representing the respective parties. One was right-wing, one was more to the left, and they had an adult debate. Even in more recent years, if we look at, I would even say Bush and Kerry. One side effect of the Trump phenomenon is it has made Bush look normal. It's made Bush, who was once a real hate figure of the left. I think the left have almost forgotten George W. Bush because Trump is so, outlandish that Bush almost looks normal. But the point is, or another example would be Clinton and Bush Senior. That those days when you had mature debates. I don't know what format these presidential debates are going to take. Time will tell. But anyway, those are all the reasons I have kind of distanced myself from the political left. Now, this is a very important point. That's a lot of critique. It does not mean I am absolutely against the left. There are still many areas I would be much more to the left. On issues to do with unemployment and economics, I'm probably still much more on the left wing side of things. That's partly from personal experience, and possibly in the next video I will lay that out. On immigration, I'm in the centre ground, so right wingers might well position that as left, but whatever. It's up to me to determine where I classify my ideology. Um, Human rights. I'm reluctant to say that's left or right wing. I don't think it's either, but I do think sometimes the right attack human rights in a way in which I think they're being short-sighted. Um, there's many other areas I would align myself with the political left. So there you have it. That's just a bit of a rundown as to why I have distanced myself from the left. If you're a centre left person, please don't think I'm against everything on the left. And there's still many people on the left who I respect and who I think are decent people and I like on a personal level. I just wouldn't necessarily agree with everything they say. I mean, I'll give an example. Ed Miliband, Nick Clegg. Um, I honestly don't think they're bad guys. I don't hate them, you know. Um, and there've been many equivalents. Bernie Sanders, he's much more to the left than me, but it's hard to dislike him personally. I think he's a decent man. And there's right wing equivalents. I mean, John Kasich is a conservative right wing Republican governor. I find him to be a likable guy. He's like someone you could have a beer with. So I try to avoid this sort of tribal thinking too much. Doesn't mean you can't have strong views, but That's basically a rundown. I have spoken at length here, so please excuse me for that. But that's basically it summed up. Could I change my view on some of these things? Quite possibly. But I will express my views before we come to a point where some of, you know, there are some on the left who will want to censor some of this stuff. Um, what I would simply say to centre left figures and centre right figures, and me as a centrist, I think it's very, very important for moderates on both sides to rein in on the more extreme or the more radical elements because unfortunately, when the radical side of a political ideology gets a foothold of something, they start to be identified with it, and then moderates get overshadowed. Unfortunately, that's what happens. So it's up to moderates to really be outspoken and say, no, this is what I believe, and this is, this is out there as well. This is also a viewpoint. Okay, thank you for watching, and let me know your thoughts.